Angkor, perhaps the single most important architectural achievement of the ancient Khmer Empire, has, through the centuries, remained a potent symbol of a heritage that unites a people and a land. Carved into the seemingly endless walls of the temples of Angkor are sublime depictions of graceful dancers who tell tales of Brahmanic mythology, and in particular, the epic story of creation, the Ramayana. Although having their origins in India, the dances depicted at Angkor during the height of the Khmer Empire 800 years ago became the inspiration for almost all classical dance throughout Southeast Asia. The churning of the Sea of Milk, where the gods work together to generate the elixir of life, is perhaps one of Angkor's most famous carvings. Born from the Sea of Milk are the thousands of beautiful female deities known as apsaras. At Angkor, more than 3,000 of these mythical beings decorate every shrine, and, like their living embodiment, the apsara dancers of today's royal ballet, each is unique. Today's apsara dancers, much like the temples of Angkor, remain one of the precious few links that modern Cambodians have to their past, a legacy that very nearly ceased to exist. By the late 14th century, the Khmer Empire was in decline, and the royal ballet that had once held such a pivotal place in the culture lost much of its importance and struggled to survive. It was not until the mid-19th century and the reign of King Ung Duang that the ancient dancers of the Khmer Empire found a new and enthusiastic protector. The royal ballet was reconstituted and restored, in part, to its former glory. But a true renaissance in the performing arts had to wait until the 1950s and 60s, when Queen Sisawat Kosamak Nirirot once again made the royal ballet a potent symbol of national identity, and it regained its rightful place at the heart of Khmer culture. Tragically, it was not to last. During the 1970s, the ballet, like every other aspect of Cambodian life, fell victim to the tumultuous events that overtook the country during more than a decade of war and revolution. Following a coup in 1970, Prince Sihanouk and most of the royal family were forced into exile, and the royal ballet lost its prima ballerina, Princess Bopa Tevi. In 1975, the Khmer Rouge took control of the country. Their destruction of royal and sacred traditions mirrored the genocidal impact they had on the lives of ordinary Cambodians. The royal ballet was dissolved, and the majority of its dancers perished. It was an irreparable loss. Miraculously, a few dancers managed to survive by fleeing the country or by keeping their past life hidden. Since 1979, the revitalization of the royal ballet has been one of the principal aims of the surviving dancers who returned to share their knowledge with a new generation of students. In 1998, Cambodia's most famous apsara dancer, Princess Bopa Tevi, became Minister of Culture and Fine Arts. Since that time, special attention has been paid to the preservation and promotion of the royal ballet. The classical dances of the royal ballet are considered a sacred link between the king and the gods, a message between the real world and the divine. Dancers execute each gesture, each movement with an extreme precision, every move expressing a meaning or an emotion. To reach the required level of skill to become a professional dancer or prima ballerina, the students have to start at an early age. From 7 or 8 years old, young girls practice on a daily basis. It is an intensive, sometimes painful training that aims to make the body's joints so supple that a hand can literally bend backwards to touch the forearm. Training can last up to 15 years. Only then, during a sacred ceremony to honour the gods and the spirits of the masks, will the young women officially become dancers. Whilst the overall decor at a performance may be simple, the handmade costumes are sumptuous and elaborate. Highly skilled costumiers make them with great care and attention. Like the dances, the secrets of making the exquisite costumes are known to only a few families and handed down from generation to generation. Before each performance, several hours of preparation are required by the dancers to put on their costumes and apply their elaborate makeup. The dazzling costumes often have to be hand-sewn on each dancer. Performances are given throughout the year to celebrate special occasions in the life of the nation. The Khmer New Year celebrations, held each year at Wat Phnom, are perhaps the most significant.
។ Among the intricate stone carvings that adorn the walls of the sacred site, researchers have been fascinated by numerous images of animals that supposedly roamed the region where the temple was built. But one, depicting what appears to be a dinosaur, has archaeologists and scholars scratching their heads.
There's a temple called Ta Prohm, and it has a series of medallions that are carved into its surface. And one medallion in particular has attracted attention because it looks like a stegosaurus. And so some have cited this as an example of a dinosaur that lived into historical times.
It's a stegosaurus not as a skeleton, but it's a stegosaurus with its skin and muscles as if somebody saw it while it was alive. So how is it possible that the artist was able to carve something like this? Did they receive the knowledge of something like this?
There's no doubt that ancient civilizations must have encountered dinosaur remains, and many of them lived in areas where dinosaurs are very abundant, and I'm sure they found them here and there. And I think that the fact that they have incorporated what appears to be dinosaurs in their artistic depictions, it speaks of an attempt to interpret them. How exactly they interpret them, I don't believe is clear. Even 200 years ago, we had a hard time figuring out how the bones of dinosaurs fit together.
What could explain the ancient builders of Angkor Wat having such a sophisticated knowledge of dinosaur anatomy? Could it be, as many ancient astronaut theorists believe, that their knowledge came firsthand as the result of actual interaction?
Welcome to an earthly paradise, or what's left of it. This is Angkor, a complex of elaborate temples in northwestern Cambodia, once home to 750,000 people. Ancient sacred sites built in the 12th century, abandoned and neglected for 700 years. But archaeologists are discovering an Angkor that is much more than just temples. Recently unearthed canals and reservoirs in a sophisticated network suggest that this was a vast metropolis.
What that tells us is that there's actually structure in here.
Now, scientists are looking for evidence of a civilization much larger than anyone ever dreamed. Water is important to many religions. It can be used to wash away evil and sin. But there's evidence that water was even more vital for the people of Angkor. Huge reservoirs and intricate canals unearthed in the jungle seem to have been used for everyday living, not just for ceremonies. If that's true, Angkor's population and size would have dwarfed the familiar sites of the central temples and their surroundings. Over 1,000 years ago, the Khmer people began to emerge from the dark and tangled forests of Southeast Asia. They were deeply influenced by Hindu and Buddhist texts and built temples to their faith. The 12th century temple of Angkor Wat, the temple of the capital. Just one of the many sanctuaries at Angkor. These are the largest sacred structures ever built, 10 times larger than any European cathedral. They're often said to be the work of the gods. Into the 11th century, the Khmer expanded their lands from the Chinese border in the north to the South China Sea, from Myanmar in the west to Vietnam in the east. But the grandeur of Angkor's temples hints at an even larger kingdom. New discoveries suggest this was the greatest city in the ancient world. These silent forests teem with evidence that suggests the real source of the kingdom's prosperity and expansion. Once before, experts linked Angkor's success to its many waterways, but the theory fell on deaf ears. Now, the investigation of a number of barais, vast water reservoirs around the temple sites, is bringing the old idea back. Professor Roland Fletcher of the University of Sydney, Australia, leads the team that is investigating this theory afresh. He explains how views have changed over the last 30 years.
The change that occurred in the 80s was that a group of English scholars began to argue that there were no outlets to the Great Barai and that there weren't any great canals, and that this was essentially water organised for a very elaborate and sophisticated ritual purpose, and for, as far as one could judge from their propositions, really no other purpose.
Experts agree that in Khmer and Hindu myth, the moats and reservoirs represent the featureless oceans, out of which the land and humans emerged. But what about the multitude of channels and dams with little apparent symbolic value? Fletcher sees them as purely utilitarian.
My interest in Angkor is very much a pragmatic interest. I'm interested in Angkor as a city, as a working place. So my initial inclination on coming in would be very much to ask, well, what's the water used for in daily life? After all, whatever else it was used for, people would undoubtedly have drunk it and used it in various ways.
Today, the Angkor waterways are still in use. Roland Fletcher's chief interest is not just the canals, but a vast reservoir. If this reservoir was built in 3 years, as Fletcher assumes, it would have taken tens of thousands of workers to construct it. This is the West Barai. The world's largest temple, Angkor Wat, can still be seen from the Barai, and for all its beauty, it's easily outclassed by West Barai's sheer size.
Everybody talks about Angkor as being enormous. But even if you take the whole enclosure of Angkor Wat, it's only a fraction of the size of the West Barai, which is the vast piece of water that we're sitting in. Angkor Wat is actually a medium-sized construction of the Khmer Empire and the Khmer world. This is the real big stuff. This is the spectacular stuff.
It's the world's biggest water reservoir, and it dates from the Middle Ages. 8 kilometers long and nearly 2 kilometers wide. But it's only a part of the Angkor water management system. The West Barai is matched by another reservoir in an identical location east of the city. But this East Barai has dried up, allowing archaeologists to uncover some of its secrets. In the green fields of the reservoir floor, Fletcher has found the remains of a structure close to its eastern edge. Could this be an outlet valve for the water? That would mean quite a sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering. In no time, the local workers strip away the vegetation. It's a massive wall, over 2 meters high and nearly as thick. And then they find drill holes, intricate workmanship on the dense laterite blocks. So this structure isn't ornamental. Canals are a serious and delicate business. You can't just fill them with water. The water must flow so it doesn't turn stagnant.
There's that big one. And then there's 2 smaller ones there. So there was a barrier here. Now that ran all the way across. They're in that wall as well over there, aren't they?
Yes, another.
Okay. So what was here at some point in time was a big fence running all the way across with quite large beams running through it. And one of the things that they could have done with that in the Angkorian period is to put matting on the Barai side, and that acts as a blocker because vegetation comes up against the matting, and that acts as a barrier to water. And then you can cut that barrier and the water flows through.
The beams suggest a system for temporarily holding back the flow, something that only a vast metropolis would need. Where the beams held back the water, Fletcher and his colleague Damien Evans find another barrier and yet another structure.
There's also this structure, which is right next to it. And this is obviously a staircase, and then there's a staircase on the other side. Right. So you get this odd business that it's like something to get across the structure.
And what about the paving stones underneath? I mean, is there an elevated sort of walkway in the base of the channel?
Yeah, we're actually standing on it.
Right.
So this is.
So this isn't just mounded earth.
No, this is a slabbed structure that runs all the way across, and its edge is just behind you.
This barrier must have acted like a threshold, slowing the water but not halting it.
What they've got to do with the vast quantities of water they have here is they've got to bring that water to a halt. They've got to slow it down all the time. They've got to get the sediment out of it, and then they've got to move it to where they want to move it.
The canals of Angkor have received scant attention over the years, probably because the recovery and restoration of the temple itself was the primary focus. But Damien Evans and Roland Fletcher of the Greater Angkor Project are out to change that. They want to find out if the water system fostered the rise and expansion of Khmer civilization. Evans investigates a tunnel underneath the walls of Angkor Thom. It means magnificent city, another major temple.
This device is designed to bring water from that moat inside the city, this walled city of Angkor Thom, into a reservoir just over here. So obviously very practical purpose. This reservoir would have been used by the people who lived in this area for their everyday uses of household activities and that kind of thing. So again, this sort of dual aspect of ritual and functional, which is displayed at sites like this.
Damien and his colleague Sam are looking for evidence that other distant settlements may have been linked to Angkor by water. About 6 miles northwest of Angkor Wat, they find an area without obvious elaborate waterworks. And yet, even here, they discover a concealed temple. Like other temples, this ruin sits on slightly higher ground. It too used to be the center of a settlement with houses, a market, and farmers' fields. The architecture matches many of the temples of Angkor, which suggests that they may have been connected. And that can only mean by canals.
Yeah, it's looking nice on the walls. Whereas previously Angkor was well known as a tightly defined central district, a walled city in the middle of this huge plain, increasingly what we're finding is that there was a great deal of life beyond those city walls, and that there was this very large web of settlement which stretched beyond that nicely planned center of the city.
No ancient inscriptions tell us the number of people living in Angkor, but the stone carvers recorded a great many details of everyday life. They brilliantly captured not only the goings-on of their kings and their gods, but also the life of ordinary mortals, whose focus was and is the market. Marketplaces opened quite early every day and were trading places and news centers. Women were apparently the better stallholders, according to the ancient sculptors. Rice and corn were currency for small trades, while prestige goods, pots and animal skins were paid for with gold and silver. Specialized traders offered the skulls of deer and other animals, possibly for use in rituals. Vegetables, fruit, fish and poultry were always available, and women were dazzled by fine silver jewelry. According to the diary of a Chinese visitor just before 1300 AD, buyers were spoiled for choice. Ivory, rhinoceros horn, beeswax, gum resin and cardamom were available, as well as wines made from honey, rice or sugar. And it all depended on the watery transportation network to flourish. Not just near the main temples, but also in the outlying areas that are completely deserted today.
It's been looted down there as well. Yeah, right.
But just how far did Angkor reach? And is enough of the transport network left after centuries of decay? And if its prosperity depended on its canals, what could have made it decline and fall? To find out how far the Angkor civilization stretched, Damien Evans expands his research beyond the temple walls of Angkor Thom. They begin their search for buried temples and waterways at a measured pace, not because of snakes or scorpions, but because of Cambodia's darker recent past. The reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979 did not spare Angkor. The temples were largely unharmed. Not even the brutal dictator Pol Pot dared trifle with the proudest symbols of Cambodia's heritage. But his troops mined a great deal of the area to keep their enemies at bay. Only in the 1990s could special units begin detecting and detonating landmines. In Angkor, archaeology can kill. So far, Roland Fletcher's team has worked all over Angkor without incident. But that's because they make aerial surveys before they set out.
Prop clear. Clear prop.
In 2002, Damien Evans began using an ultralight aircraft equipped with a camera to search for archaeological sites on terrain that may be mined. That was fine for avoiding mines, but finding the hidden boundaries of Angkor required something more. The temple sites they were looking for were probably well hidden under the forest canopy.
All you can see is the vegetation cover. It's basically a blanket of green over the top of the landscape in this area. What you really need to do is to have a tool which will allow you to really pull apart the subtle differences in vegetation, the variations in wet and dry in the landscape, and make those very distinct for archaeologists to analyse and to be able to map the particular features that those images draw out.
The team found the perfect tool for the job at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. It turns out space is extremely useful to earthbound archaeology. On one of the flights of the space shuttle, NASA directed the attention of the crew to Cambodia to map the whole Angkor region. What the space shuttle delivered were images of Angkor, color-coded and showing countless man-made changes in the terrain, seen here in green and yellow. What was needed now was a closer look at elevation, slight rises in the height of the soil. These could indicate earthen platforms for as yet undiscovered temple sites. And so a second NASA mission took off for Angkor, on a plane, not a spaceship. The plane carried AirSAR, an all-weather imaging radar which could shoot through cloud cover. What's more, it could also penetrate the forest canopy.
We knew from talking to the archaeologists that a lot of the sites of archaeological interest had subtle elevation differences from a fraction of a meter to several meters, and varied in size from maybe 20 meters on a side to over a kilometer on a side. And what we were able to do with the data is by color coding the elevation differences, we were able to make subtle height differences very visible and easy to find.
The images showed conspicuous height differences that could well turn out to be archaeological features. Of the hundreds of potential sites, only a few were expected to yield new structures that might have been part of a larger Angkor. But then, Damien combined all these results into a new map. A map that gave the world a new Angkor altogether. All of it linked by waterways. This was suddenly a vast city, littered with structures. More than 70 unknown buildings and hundreds of archaeological sites. In an area of more than 1,000 square kilometers, 3 times greater than ever imagined. Archaeological signposts were suddenly identified in places that had been considered before, but without result. Newfound temple sites were in some cases just subtle humps and bumps in the landscape, lurking in the jungle for centuries, just waiting for an inquiring mind to come along. The future for archaeology in Angkor is suddenly very promising.
What we've discovered with these new maps is the urban landscape of Angkor beyond the well-known temples in the middle. We've systematically documented hundreds of new sites, including temples and canals, which really give a picture of the urban landscape of Angkor as a whole. You really need the aerial perspective to bring that into sharper focus. In its entirety, it stretches across at least 1,000 square kilometres, which makes it really in the same league as the modern-day metropolises that many of us live in.
This finding has changed history. Angkor is not just magnificent architecture. This was a culture that supported a large, seemingly content population, and seems to have done it with style and grace. And water. No water-dependent civilization has ever had so much success for so long. So the ancient Khmer may have a message in a bottle that could prove useful to us. And just possibly life-saving. Angkor was not just its temples, it was the cultural and economic center of the region. And that's why it's so instructive for modern city planners. This was a metropolis bigger than New York City. New York has an area of 780 square kilometers. Discovery of the new sites puts Greater Angkor at more than 1,000 square kilometers. The largest city of the pre-industrial world. The ingenious water management system made it all work. The system connects the far-flung settlements with each other. Roland Fletcher has moved his team to the end of the structure, the ancient canal near the East Barai, which they have worked on so intensively over the last few days. These modern engineers are stunned by the sophistication of the Khmer waterworks. Roland has discovered a small channel along the edge of the wall. But it comes as a surprise to find the end of the structure so abruptly blocked. Normally, at a place like this, it would be essential to keep the water flowing.
What is most interesting about this is that it stops at this point, and this here has a lot of laterite gravel in it, so there is a possibility that the structure from here on has actually been removed.
But why clip the end off a canal? Wasn't this a vital part of their system, connected directly to the reservoir? It's not enough for scientists to record what they find. They need to understand it. When archaeologists identify alterations in a structure, they call it a structure with a history. And like all history, it needs to be read. Damien and Sam are taking core samples to find out just how important the canal really was. If it has a stone floor, this may be a major canal.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very sharp boundary. So, I mean, this is what you'd expect in a canal. Like, you've got some sands in there. I mean, it's still very clay. And look, you've actually got quite a coarse grain in there as well. And this is obviously a laterite block that we've just cored into.
The really interesting thing about this particular place is that it seems to have a masonry floor, a constructed stone base to it, and that's not something that you see very often at all in the Angkorian world. There are only maybe 2 or 3 instances of this that I know of.
Most of the paved canals are used for the water supply in the center of the city. But the Khmer built another outside their city. This one seems to have had a spiritual purpose. These stones are the tops of linga, symbols of the Hindu god Shiva. They represent the power of creation and the promise of fertility. Water, and especially flowing water, is often endowed with spiritual properties that lift it out of the ordinary. The carved bed of Kbal Speen is perhaps the holiest of all the canals in Angkor. Underwater, the lingas here represent Shiva in his absolute form. Each of them confronts, delays, or propels the water. Water which is seen as fertilizing the land of the Khmer, just as the river Ganges does in India. Kbal Speen is on an elevated plain 20 miles northeast of Angkor Wat. From the plain, the water runs down to the lowland flats, merging with the moats and barais in the center of Angkor. The now sanctified canal connects the holy waters of Kbal Speen with the city. For too long, many archaeologists assumed these hydraulic structures, like the settlements, were only found near the central temples. But they were wrong. We know now that the water system was much greater than anyone guessed.
Before the aerial approach was systematically applied at Angkor, people knew of maybe 24 canals in this area. We now know of over 200, close to 250 probably. So a lot of the old arguments about the water management system, that it wasn't very complex, that it wasn't very elaborate, that it had no distribution system, we now know to be false. So really it's turned some of the traditional arguments about Angkor and the system and the role it played at Angkor completely upside down. In fact, we know now that the water management system was capable of providing additional food by way of irrigation to a substantial number of people, and that it really would have made a significant difference to the viability of Angkor as a settlement.
It was all a vast, spidery network of waterways and basins. Life-giving canals supplying the people and pleasing the gods. A 1,000 years ago, the aim of the Khmer rulers was probably to guarantee a continuous water flow for the paddy fields to maximize the yields. A burgeoning population had to be fed. Rice farmers have been in central Cambodia since about 3000 BC, but Angkor vastly increased demand. More and more new channels and ponds were dug. The need for consistent rice harvests meant Angkor's water system was the wellspring of power for its rulers. The Khmer must have worked constantly with brigades of diggers and engineers to upgrade and maintain their canals. The work was organized under a strong central authority, aware of the hazards of failure. Drought, famine, disease, and economic collapse if the transport system should break down. Today, the descendants of the ancient Khmer are again at work on a canal. At the East Barai, they reveal an unexpected feature, which seems to undercut the theory that the structure is an outlet for the reservoir.
All that way. No, not up there, here.
The excavation has exposed another wall, but this one is a lateral wall running across the entire canal.
What this tells us is that the channel, which was originally open running through to the east was at some point blocked by putting this enormous wall right across the channel.
This wall is massive, more than 1 meter high and 3 meters wide. This is not built to slow the water, but to stop it completely. Judging by the masonry, Roland Fletcher dates it to the 12th or 13th century, hundreds of years after the canal was first built. But why would the Khmer block a canal they had worked on so intensely? Why would they stop water flowing out of the Barai? The answer is, the water wasn't flowing out of the Barai. It was now coming into the Barai, and that could indicate a possible water shortage.
At some point after the 12th century, the use of this structure has been turned around. It's been turned from being an outlet to being an inlet.
To bring in new water, the Khmer opened a wide gap in its longitudinal walls. To move fresh water into this structure, they diverted a 20-meter wide neighboring canal, flowing in the opposite direction. That means water would have been gushing into the Barai.
The context then is that they are stopping the original use of the Barai as a mechanism for shunting water elsewhere in Angkor. So then the question comes, what is involved in stopping moving that water? If they're holding this water here, what then are they using it for? And what is happening to the areas that no longer get water?
As more and more temples were built at Angkor in the 12th century, it's likely that the demand for water was rising too. In fact, King Jayavarman VII embarked on a grand construction program of both public works and monuments. In his 40-year reign, the king began work on numerous temples. It's said that 80,000 people worked to build and maintain the temple of Ta Prohm. And Ta Prohm is not even half the size of Angkor Wat. It took a lot of stone breaking, transport and carving to make a temple. And armies of humans to do the back-breaking work. Many of them would have been slaves. The best way to understand Khmer building techniques is to do it ourselves. Here, the old collapsed stones are being reassembled. The reconstruction of Baphwan Temple has been underway for 50 years, and the results are often confused and frustrating. But a German-Cambodian team has found a way to re-erect a temple in a fraction of the time, virtually. Their training ground is the Preah Khan Temple, built in the late 12th century. The project is called Virtual Angkor. It's based at the University of Heidelberg, but not in its archaeology department. These are mathematicians, and their approach is very different.
The special way in which the Khmer, the ancient Khmer, constructed their temple is so that each stone is absolutely unique. It had a unique way in which it was fitted to the neighboring stones. You can even identify which stones were laid before each other. Each stone is very individual and very unique, and that simplifies the work, the mathematical and computational methods, in order to reconstruct the whole building from these elements.
So far, the project has reconstructed parts of the temple with software called the Angkor Temple Generator. It excludes all the combinations of neighboring stones that can't work, and then uses the remaining options to assemble a structure that must be correct. It's an expensive but satisfying jigsaw puzzle, a puzzle that will bring this ancient world back to life. First, every identifiable detail of each stone has to be collected.
Of course we need the sizes, but especially we need these ingoing corners to see where the stones belong to. This looks great.
The archaeologists have many questions that need to be answered. How were the vast sandstone blocks made? How did they manage to place the stones on top of each other so seamlessly, letting the sculptors carve over the gaps so flawlessly that it looks like one stone? Why do so many stones have these characteristic holes, something you don't see on Egyptian pyramids or Mayan temples? A relief from the Bayon temple wall reveals the secret. Khmer engineers invented a way of lifting the blocks without needing a rope underneath. This ensured the blocks had a very tight fit. It was grueling work. The largest stones weighed over 2 tons. The enormous pressures on the seams made the gaps almost invisible and allowed the sculptors to carve right across them. This sanding technique grinds the stones smoother and smoother. In time, the faces become so completely flat that not even a palm leaf can slip between them. The holes in the sides of each block were for wooden poles, used as handles for grinding and for lifting the blocks. The holes encourage a belief that still has currency among Cambodians. The temples are the work of giants. The holes are simply where they put their fingers to lift the blocks. This belief has a kind of spiritual truth. This is architecture that's so stunning, it's fitting that it was built, if not for the gods, then by them. But something went seriously wrong, and archaeologists are getting closer to the reason why. Over time, the Khmer royal fascination with temples never diminished. In fact, the temples got larger and larger. Over 1,000 temples have now been identified in the Angkor region. More and greater temples demanded more workers. More workers needed more rice, and more rice paddies had to be watered with more canals. It couldn't last.
What you're looking at in this area, and that this huge system managed, this 1,000 square kilometers of channels, would be somewhere up to about 750,000 human beings. And it's perfectly feasible for this landscape to actually provide rice for that number of people. The big question, and this is the thing that shows up in a structure like this, is whether in fact the infrastructure eventually became a problem in itself.
This area, barely inhabited today, looked completely different in ancient times. Near the main temples, there was a sea of simple wooden houses. At a time when London had about 30,000 inhabitants, almost 1 million people lived in Angkor. People also lived in the suburbs stretched out along the canals. an urban strip development, as in so many American suburbs today. Angkor flourished for 6 centuries. But around 1400 AD, the dream began to die. The urban complex had outreached its resources. The people who had built the imposing barais, canals and temples failed to keep pace with change and growth. The growing problems are clearly visible. This wall was once a bridge east of the city centre during the heyday of Angkor. What was a walkway across the canal was turned into a dam by blocking its spans and diverting the water to more needy places. But soon the dam failed.
Unlike earlier bridges in the Angkor period, which were very carefully crafted from custom-made blocks, here they've basically pillaged blocks from a nearby temple to build it. So we start to get the feeling at this stage of Angkor's history that more and more ad hoc solutions were being made, and that the engineering capacity and technical ability of Angkor to control their water problems was decreasing substantially.
Nearly 1 million people had made themselves dependent on an artificial water supply that was beginning to fail. The water control structures and bridges were becoming useless. Within decades, the water table fell sharply.
The Angkorian people essentially remodeled and reconfigured the entire landscape in this area. All of the forest was cleared completely, and the entire landscape was rebuilt into a human environment rather than the pre-existing natural environment.
Ever since European traders in the late 16th century first described the impressive towers of Angkor Wat, people have wondered why this once gilded temple was abandoned 500 years ago. The usual suspects include marauding invaders, a religious revolution, or a geological upset. But the collapse here suggests something different. That environmental mishaps can doom even the most carefully engineered urban landscapes. The Khmer were the oldest civilization in Southeast Asia. According to mythology, they were descended from the serpent god Naga. After 600 years of growth, their city witnessed its tragic downfall. The kings lost their influence, and the hemorrhaging could not be stopped. In the 15th century, Phonir Yat, the last king of Angkor, made a final desperate attempt to change the gods' minds and save the empire. In a ritual which had been performed for centuries, Naga, the snake goddess, who ruled over Angkor's prosperity, appeared every night in the shape of a beautiful girl to unite with the king. The Khmer rulers were the links between heaven and earth, mediators between the gods and mankind. Usually it was believed the encounter brought wealth and growth. But on this night, the stakes were higher. The act had to save the empire from catastrophe. But Naga, for the very first time, scorned the king. And the Khmer reluctantly began to leave their city. Their gods were gone, and the city was given back to nature. Since that time, the trees have forced their roots into every crevice and have scattered vast stones like feathers. A people had overexploited their resources and paid the consequences. It's a familiar story.
Well, the resonance of this is rather eerie. If you think of what we're looking at, we have a giant infrastructure, and that's part of an enormous network that covers 1,000 square kilometers. What's really eerie about this, we have giant infrastructure in a massive low-density city. And that is exactly what we have in the modern world. The industrial world produces low-density cities with massive infrastructure. When you add on top of that somewhere between the 1300s and the 1700s, there was a climate change globally, whose impact we don't understand yet here, it all begins to look rather topical.
In the end, most of the people of Angkor left their city. But some temples were never completely abandoned. A handful of temple servants and monks tirelessly struggled to save a few from absolute ruin. And in contrast to Greek or Egyptian ruins, Angkor has remained a pilgrimage site for Buddhists. Angkor's spiritual heritage is intact. That is the final and paradoxical message of these stones. The spirit lives on.
In 1860, a French naturalist was cutting his way through the Cambodian jungle in search of exotic insects. Henri Mouot suddenly came across the last thing he was expecting, a massive complex of stone temples. Mouot had stumbled across one of the world's most astonishing and enduring architectural feats, the 900-year-old remains of Angkor Wat. But who built these vast, sophisticated temples? Why construct them deep in the jungle, only to abandon them? At first, there were no answers. Then, an amazing eyewitness account from the 13th century emerged in China. The author describes the great temple of Angkor, a fantastic citadel, and its resourceful inhabitants. How could this be true? The evidence was scant. Now science is providing unexpected proof. Archaeologists are applying the latest techniques to reveal the mysteries of Angkor. And radar images from space reveal that Angkor was much bigger than originally imagined. A vast city, the size of London. Scientists now know that Angkor Wat was just a small part of one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. Angkor Wat, one of the world's true enigmas. Its size and purpose baffling. Larger than any cathedral, it is truly one of the greatest structures ever built. Its towers, shaped like lotus flowers, were raised 100 years before the Cathedral of Chartres in France. The buildings are laid out on a vast scale, stone shrines ascending one upon the other as if reaching for the heavens. Endless corridors are carved with the longest reliefs in the world. The precise construction would be hard to match even with lasers used by modern surveyors. Archaeologist Charles Hyam has studied all aspects of Angkor and its inhabitants, the Khmer. Professor Hyam has been crucial to understanding the extraordinary history of this ancient culture.
We're standing in the middle of the world's largest religious monument. It's absolutely gigantic. It stretches on and on. Angkor Wat was the temple mausoleum of one of Angkor's greatest kings, King Suryavarman II, the Sun King. And when he died, his ashes would have been placed under the heart of the central lotus tower behind me.
Angkor Wat, meaning Holy Temple, is symbolic in every way. Its vast square moat represents the oceans around Mount Meru, legendary home of the Hindu gods. When Henri Mouot stumbled across Angkor in 1860, he wrote, "One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome." The Frenchman suspected that the temples belonged to a huge and sophisticated civilization, but he had no evidence. Angkor Wat lies in the northwest floodplains of Cambodia, just above the Great Lake. When Mouot discovered it in 1860, only a handful of Buddhist monks and local villagers lived around the ancient site. None of them knew how Angkor Wat had evolved or who had built it. Legend had it that the Great Temple had built itself. Some said that it had always been there. In Europe, the publication of Mouot's journal created a sensation. Soon, a stream of explorers, photographers, and archaeologists traveled east, keen to uncover the mysteries of this vanished world. But Henri Mouot's part in this puzzle came to a sudden end. Bitten by a poisonous insect, he died in the jungle a year after discovering the incredible site. As early explorers began to strip away the jungle, they discovered even more temples. The walls of the vast monuments were covered in intricate carvings. These reliefs illustrate legends of an ancient culture and its religion. The sandstone sections were carved in place. They would have taken the artists decades to complete. Inscriptions here are written not only in an ancient Cambodian language, but also, mysteriously, in Sanskrit, the priestly language of the Hindus.
One of the great breakthroughs has been the translation of the entire corpus of Angkorian inscriptions by a French scholar, Georges Sedez, in 7 thick volumes. And so, bit by bit, the actual internal history of Angkor has been unravelled, and that's been absolutely critical.
To the code breakers, they disclosed that for 6 centuries Angkor had been the capital of the Khmer, the indigenous people of Cambodia. Between the 9th and 15th centuries AD, a total of 38 kings ruled their empire from Angkor. Its borders reached from southern Vietnam to Laos, and from the Mekong River to eastern Burma. But whose grand vision was this great city? And why was it built in the middle of the jungle? The deciphering continued. Then an astonishing discovery was made. A junior Chinese official on a diplomatic mission visited Angkor in the summer of 1296 AD. During his year-long visit, Zhou Daguan kept a journal. His diary tells of a major civilization, a capital much bigger and more developed than the archaeologists dared imagine. But was Zhou Daguan's account fact or myth? Archaeologists searched for proof of the existence of the city Zhou described. As they pieced together this gigantic puzzle, the full story began to emerge. For thousands of years, the indigenous people of Cambodia, the Khmer, had cut rice fields from the jungle. These farmers were a largely self-contained and peaceful race. But from the 1st century AD, small feuding kingdoms developed around the country. In the 8th century, a great leader emerged. To find a site for a brand new sacred capital, he abandoned his home city in the eastern part of Cambodia and ordered all his subjects to cross the Mekong River in a great march west. Having conquered his rivals, he chose the lush land between the sacred Kulen Hills and the Great Lake for his new citadel. In 802 AD, he had himself crowned Jayavarman, the supreme world emperor, king of kings. Jayavarman's charisma won the people over. He came not only to rule by divine consent, but to be worshipped as a god himself. At a stroke, this great and charismatic leader changed the course of Cambodian history. Over the next 500 years, Jayavarman's descendants, living gods, succeeded him to reign in Angkor. Each king had his own monument built to his glory, destined to become his mausoleum. Since the 2nd century AD, the Khmers had practiced Hinduism. Each of the royal temples is modelled on the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the home of the Indian gods. For their builders, the shrines were a celebration of religion, art, science, and power. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, Cambodia was part of France's colonial empire. It was they who led the way in piecing Angkor together.
When they arrived and took colonial control of this part of the world, the place was an absolute shambles. I mean, there were stones just lying around everywhere. It was nothing like what you see today. And so they dedicated vast amount of energy and effort into the reconstruction of the temples.
In the 1960s, the eminent archaeologist Bernard-Philippe Grolier made this comparison of Angkor. Imagine that within the city limits of Paris, you found thrown together Versailles, the Place de la Concorde, and the Louvre. Surrounding these, the cathedrals of Notre Dame, Chartres, and Rheims, flanked by all the churches built in Paris before the 19th century. Since Henri Mouhot had first discovered Angkor in 1860, much had been learned about its history. But almost nothing was known about the culture responsible for these incredible monuments. The largest religious monument in the world, the City of the Gods, Angkor Wat in the heart of Cambodia. But is this astonishing temple only the visible tip of a greater unseen mystery? 700 years ago, a junior Chinese official visited Angkor on a diplomatic mission. During his 11-month stay with a Cambodian family, he recorded many aspects of life in Angkor. But Zhou Daguan's account contains several flights of fancy. For instance, he describes the great temple of Angkor Wat as having been built in a single day by a legendary Chinese architect. He was also openly judgmental, referring to his hosts as barbarians. Archaeologists have taken his writings with a pinch of salt.
You've always got to think of it as being seen through the eyes of an educated Chinese, for whom anyone beyond the empire was, by definition, a barbarian. And in reading what he has to say, one has to be, certainly on occasion, judicious in realizing that the prejudices were there.
For 100 years, French archaeologists were too busy restoring the temples to pay the journal much attention, so it was largely ignored. Then, in the 1970s, the murderous regime of Pol Pot stopped all work at Angkor. His army of communist revolutionaries, the Khmer Rouge, laid thousands of landmines around the site, rendering it off-limits for years. Now at last, stability has returned to Cambodia, and work on the temples has resumed. Today, Angkor has World Heritage Site protection, with a dozen countries funding archaeological research. With much of the major restoration work complete, the focus has shifted away from the temples at the center and onto the outlying pieces of the puzzle. Just north of Angkor Wat, an 8-mile wall encloses the remains of several magnificent stone temples. Explorer Henri Muot suspected in 1860 that this was once the Khmer's great capital of Angkor Thom, the holy city. The perfectly square wall, like Angkor Wat, is surrounded by a moat and covers an area the size of Manhattan Island. At its center is the Bayon Temple. In his journal from 1296, Zhou Daguan describes a busy city teeming with life. Archaeologists are now looking for evidence that this is the great metropolis he was describing. But any evidence has all but vanished under dense forest. In the last 2 years, archaeologist Jacques Gaucher has started to excavate the interior of the walled city.
When I started this study, we knew almost nothing because everything was covered in forest. The only surviving features were the stone temples and the foundation of a royal palace, but we knew nothing of the rest of the 900 hectares within the city wall.
For a while, it seemed that Gaucher was fighting a losing battle, but his persistence is at last producing results.
After 2 years of very difficult research, we've at last begun to build an impression of this city.
Gaucher is plotting thousands of coordinates onto an ever more detailed map of Angkor Thom. He is now able to trace an intricate grid system of canals and roads, together with the sites of thousands of wooden houses. Back in 1860, when Henri Muot discovered Angkor Wat, he had suspected that it was just part of a complex city. Zhou Daguan's 13th century journal alludes to a political and religious citadel. Now, at last, archaeologists have enough evidence to bring to life this extraordinary city as it looked 700 years ago. Angkor was a capital far bigger and far in advance of any European city of the time. Jacques Gaucher's findings confirm the accuracy of Zhou Daguan's account. What he describes is fact, not fantasy.
These are the monuments which have caused merchants from overseas to speak so often of Cambodia the rich and noble. If you are looking for gold lions, gold Buddhas, bronze elephants and bronze horses, this is where you'll find them.
From the inscriptions, archaeologists know that Angkor Thom, the holy city, was built nearly a century before Zhou arrived by the Khmer's greatest monarch. Jayavarman VII ruled over Cambodia between 1181 and 1219. Known as the Great Builder King, he expanded the empire further than any other Khmer ruler. Within the city walls, the king built a palace befitting his mighty empire.
The royal palace stands to the north of the Golden Tower. Lintels and columns, all decorated with carved and painted Buddhas, are immense. The roofs too are impressive. Long colonnades and open corridors stretch away, interlaced in harmonious relation.
Jacques Gaucher's excavations at the royal palace confirm Zhou's account.
We found evidence that this palace was a large area with interconnecting courtyards and buildings. We found holes 80 centimeters in diameter for huge supporting columns. It would have been a very impressive sight.
As evidence materializes about the royal palace, the role of the Khmer's rulers, these earthly gods, becomes clearer. During his stay, Zhou Daguan had several audiences with the ruling king.
Every time I was admitted to the palace for an audience with the king, he came forward with his chief wife and took his place in the embrasure of the golden window in the main audience hall.
Zhou himself came from a culture with a ruler elevated to godhood. The Chinese approved of the Khmer's devotion.
These people know what is due a king.
The king topped a social pyramid that stretched down to the lowest peasant. The monarch's potency showed itself in a legend Zhou Daguan relates.
Out of the palace rises a golden tower, to the top of which the ruler ascends nightly to sleep. It is common belief that in the tower dwells a genie, formed like a serpent with 9 heads, which is lord of the entire kingdom. Every night, the genie appears in the shape of a woman with whom the sovereign couples. Should the genie fail to appear for a single night, it is a sign that the king's death is at hand. If the king should fail to keep his tryst, disaster is sure to follow.
Well, I'm not sure about that. He would have been a fine king had he been able to do that for any length of time. But what we do know is that it was a practice of the aristocrats to send, and the regional landed gentry, as it were, to send up a woman from their family to be a member of the king's entourage, to become a concubine, which would, in a sense, bind the provinces to the centre in a very physical manner. And it wouldn't be surprising if indeed the king did have a very substantial harem from which to choose.
Zhou Daguan notes that the king had 5 wives and a harem of 3,000 women. The king was rarely seen outside the palace, but Zhou describes one such occasion, the New Year festival.
As night comes on, the king is besought to take part in the spectacle. The rockets are fired and the crackers touched off. The rockets can be seen from 13 kilometers away. The firecrackers, large as swivel guns, shake the whole city.
Below the king was an army of bureaucrats graded by rank, as Zhou describes.
In this country, there is a hierarchy of ministers, generals, astronomers and other functionaries. Beneath these come all sorts of small employees, differing only in name from our own.
These would all have been descendants of families honored by the original Jayavarman, who had founded Angkor 500 years earlier. What is not clear from Zhou's writings is how many people lived in Angkor. Sanskrit inscriptions in temples such as Ta Prohm offer valuable clues.
We know that the temple housed at least 12,000 people, including a number of great priests, I think over 650 dancers and various other officiants to maintain the temple and to do the necessary temple duties.
If 12,000 people served a single temple, what was the overall population? Jacques Gaucher's new research is not yet complete, but it does support an educated guess.
To give a number, this city could have been between 80,000, 90,000 and 150,000 people.
In the same period, the population of London totaled no more than 30,000. So, discoveries are confirming that what Henri Mouot suspected and Zhou Daguan alleges is correct. Angkor Thom was indeed a large, well-structured city with a huge population. Now suspicions are aroused that the jungle conceals an altogether bigger surprise. A metropolis so vast that its full extent can only be detected from space. The search for the hidden empire of Angkor was about to take an unexpected turn. In 1994, archaeologists persuaded NASA to undertake a unique task. The space agency had developed specialist radar to penetrate vegetation. Their challenge was to probe the area of Angkor in Cambodia as the Space Shuttle Endeavour passed over Southeast Asia. The resulting images cover an area 100 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. For the first time, scientists have an accurate impression of the wider city's infrastructure 1,000 years ago. Covering an area the size of London, this rural metropolis was immense. For archaeologist Elizabeth Moore, this is a major breakthrough.
Up into this central statue. I'm sure they had the skill to do it, don't you?
It is revolutionizing understanding of the size of the kingdom.
Forced water up.
And at first people said, well, you won't find anything new at Angkor, but we have. And what the radar has shown us is just how all the regions contributed to what then became the central zone of Angkor.
The radar pictures also reveal previously unknown temples all over the Angkorian basin, as well as an intricate network of roads and canals, all leading to the walled city. Evident for the first time is the grid plan of this once great metropolis.
When you start looking at the radar imagery and you see the sophistication with which they were able to control and alter their terrain, I've never seen a culture like it elsewhere in Southeast Asia in terms of manipulating the landscape, of using it to their benefit.
Now, the challenge for archaeologists was to work out at ground level what had been photographed from space. Archaeologist Christophe Potier is using the images as a route map to trace the layout of ancient Angkor. The newly discovered temples were at the center of their own communities. Just like village churches in Europe, they indicate the size of each settlement, showing the true extent of the metropolis. Today, Potier and his Cambodian assistant, Sin Chenda, attempt to locate a number of previously unrecorded ruins outside the walled city of Angkor Thom.
Wow, super. It's a quite nice one. It seems to be a Garuda. You can see very clearly the Garuda with his wings is like an eagle, and quite interesting. Unfortunately, it has been badly damaged, but it's nice. And compared to the style, it could be a late 9th century, maybe first part of the 10th.
Temples like this would have been the centers of villages housing between 100 and 300 people. Potier and his colleagues have established that the number of temple sites like this in the region runs into thousands, suggesting a massive population. There was a direct relationship between these villages and the royal capital. An ancient inscription persuades archaeologists like Charles Hyam of the link.
We know that at least 80,000 or so people from 3,000 villages were assigned to supply all the goods that we needed annually to maintain it in a good condition.
Vast amounts of produce and thousands of people would have been transported from the villages. A complex network of roads leading to the center is evident from the NASA pictures. The inscriptions point to the great builder king, Jayavarman.
Jayavarman VII was a fantastic builder. Across his whole kingdom, he had roads constructed. He was a great man for infrastructure, one reason being that he wanted pilgrims to go and visit his places. And so he had rest houses built at one day's journey apart. He moved and shaped more stone than every other Angkorian king combined. And he must go down in world history as one of the great builders of all time.
If all the outlying temples were connected in one giant conurbation, then Angkor can be acknowledged as a rural metropolis, as big as modern-day London. At its heart, a walled royal enclave the size of Westminster.
There are hundreds, let's say thousands of that kind of small sanctuaries spread all around the area of Angkor, but the large area of Angkor. And it's that show, obviously, when there was village everywhere, almost everywhere.
Early research suggests that this metropolis could have had a population of 1 million people. This would make Angkor, at its peak, between the 11th and 13th centuries, one of the largest cities in the world. The indigenous Cambodians, the Khmer, were powerful and successful. They managed to build one of the most extraordinary cities in history, in one of the world's most hostile climates. But how was such a large population able to survive and prosper in the heart of an inhospitable jungle? The answer lies in the Khmer's ability to harness their most precious asset. Cambodia has 8 months without rain, when rivers become a muddy trickle. Then, for a few months, the monsoon brings floods. For this reason, Angkor is built close to the Great Lake, which swells to 4 times its size in the rainy season. It not only provided precious water throughout the year, but also an inexhaustible supply of fish. Zhou Daguan records,
"Of all the fish, the black carp is the most abundant, Next in number, the tench and freshwater congers. The prawns of Channan weigh as much as half a kilo apiece. Crocodiles there are as large as boats.
Apart from fish, the staple diet, like most of Asia, was rice. Paddy fields need a plentiful supply of water to ensure a healthy crop. When the founding ruler Jayavarman arrived at Angkor, there were already peasant farmers cultivating ancient rice fields. But from the 9th to the 13th centuries, successive god kings ordered thousands more acres of jungle to be cleared for rice production. Water had to be cleverly harnessed to irrigate the new fields. If the system failed, the very survival of the kingdom would be at stake. Well-maintained canals were also crucial to Angkor. Every day, tons of heavy stones for the construction of temples would be transported by canal from the Kulen Hills, 50 kilometers away. Planning expert Jacques Gaucher believes the success of Angkor is due to the elaborate system of interconnecting waterways.
You have tanks or ponds which are dug to keep also this water, and you have some canalization. This royal palace is full of small canalization. The city is full of channels, and the outside, the territory, is also full of big channels. These systems, which are at different level of scale, they must have been connected to each other.
It was the Khmer's ability to harness water that made them unique. While the Dutch were experimenting with their first canals, the Khmer were already past masters. The most recent excavation by Jacques Gaucher reveals the complexity of Khmer water management within the royal city. His surveys have uncovered two huge reservoirs, each measuring 300 meters long and 20 meters wide. A major road intersected them. Water needed to flow around the city. What Gaucher wanted to know was how the road could be used while water still flowed from one reservoir to the other. So he began to dig. The excavation unearthed a stone dike where the road and reservoirs met. It also shows that the reservoirs were built on slightly different levels. Beneath the surface of the road, narrow channels in the dike allow water to filter from the upper reservoir into the lower. But the arrangement may have been too finely balanced.
Playing at such a scale with the management of water, with such small differences of level, I think the system was quite fragile. And if there were any variability in the environment or in the maintenance of the city, for social problems or political ones, I think the precision, I mean the ultra sophistication can have been a weakness in the system in a way.
This complex system provided water throughout the royal city for drinking, cooking, and even bathing.
Cambodia is an excessively hot country, and it is impossible to get through the day without bathing several times. There are no bathhouses, no basins. However, every family has a pond, or several families have one in common. Men and women go naked into this pond.
The construction of extensive water systems and great stone temples in the jungle demanded colossal manpower. Why would the Khmer be prepared to devote so much of their year toiling in the king's name?
Why was it that the peasantry out there in the fields contributed so much labour, willingly it seems, to the maintenance of the centre? And the answer may well be that they really believed that the king was a god, and they were working in the service of the deity, and this kept them going.
Oh, I think without a doubt, I fully agree with you. You couldn't have built the city of Angkor without that kind of firm belief.
But although the Khmer people dedicated enormous effort into constructing their great city, it was the addition of slave labor that made it possible. Zhou describes these unfortunates.
Wild men from the hills can be bought to serve as slaves. Families of wealth may own more than 100. Those of lesser means content themselves with 10 or 20. Only the very poor have none.
We know, too, again from the inscriptions, that some of them had a very raw deal. There was one who tried to escape from the land in which he was born and was assigned, and they found him, and they brought him back, and they gouged his eyes out and cut off his ears.
Punishment was severe for all subjects of Angkor, noted the Chinese diplomat.
In very serious cases, a ditch is dug outside the city. The criminal is dropped into it. Earth and stones are heaped on top until he is buried alive. Lesser crimes are dealt with by cutting off feet or hands, or by amputating the nose.
The economy of Angkor was based on international trade. The Khmers produced food for their swelling population, but there was a surplus for trade with neighboring states. They wove fine cloth, cast huge bronze statues, and exported ivory, kingfisher feathers, beeswax, and scented wood. Their main trading partner was China.
The reliefs of the Bayon reveal a Chinese trade junk coming across the waters of the Great Lake just south of Angkor. And we know that there was indeed a great deal of trade going on because of the more recent archaeological research that has been excavating in the Royal Palace, and there they've been unearthing a considerable quantity of Chinese ceramics.
Zhou Daguan's delegation were not the only Chinese in Angkor. In fact, Chinese settlers had been there for years.
The Chinese always take a wife here as soon as they arrive, deriving additional benefit from the woman's business skills. In Cambodia, it is the women who take charge of trade. There are no shops in which the merchants live. Instead, they display their goods on matting spread on the ground.
Women held positions of power and authority. They owned property, engaged in trade, and even served as bodyguards to the king. But the Chinese interest in Cambodian women was not driven solely by trade.
Everyone with whom I talked said that the Cambodian women are highly sexed. 1 or 2 days after giving birth to a child, they are ready for intercourse. If a husband is not responsive, he will be discarded.
By the end of the 13th century, Angkor was at its peak. A succession of god kings had built this beautiful and astonishing city. A sophisticated water system made the city work, fed its people, and created wealth. But then, at its very peak, cracks in the system began to appear. Cracks that would lead to the city being abandoned to the jungle. It took nearly 500 years for Angkor to grow to the vast city that the Chinese diplomat Zhou Daguan described in 1296. Yet just a century later, the city lay deserted, given up to the jungle. But why? Throughout history, there are few examples of cities being totally abandoned. One key factor is known. Throughout Angkor's history, the Khmer had waged war with their neighbors. years of Angkor, the Vietnamese Chams were the Khmer's sworn enemies. Most of the temple walls around the capital depict epic battles against the Chams. But by the time of Zhou Daguan's visit, the main threat came from the emerging Thai kingdom of Siam as it expanded into Cambodia. He recounts.
Recently, during the war with Siam, whole villages have been laid waste.
In the diplomat's eyes, the Khmer army was ill-prepared for war.
Soldiers move about unclothed and barefoot. In the right hand is carried a lance, in the left a shield. They have no bows, no missiles, no breastplates, and no helmets. Generally speaking, these people have neither discipline nor strategy.
Inscriptions show that in 1431, the Thais sacked Angkor. They looted everything possible, enslaving much of the population, including the king's entire harem, and carried them off to Thailand. Abandoned, the city of Angkor was slowly reabsorbed into the jungle from which it had emerged 5 centuries before. Henri Mouot wrote in 1860, "One must ask, what has become of this powerful race, so civilized and enlightened to create these gigantic works?" The conventional explanation is that the empire's rulers lost their grip on power, and the Thais simply scared them off. But the mystery of Angkor takes another twist. Today, archaeologists believe that there were other factors at work. Charles Hyam points to the great builder king, Jayavarman VII.
Perhaps because of the excesses of Jayavarman VII, who clearly was a builder with a frenzy of activity. And he may well, it's said, and it might be true, that he exhausted the resources of the state and it went into a decline.
Jayavarman VII was the first Buddhist king after several hundred years of Hindu worship. This more compassionate religion may have given the Khmer cause to reflect on the excesses of their kings.
And I wonder whether, in fact, the slow decline that may well have set in was the result of a lack of belief out in the fields there that the king was in fact a deity, and that this vital link between the two began to fray.
Jacques Gaucher theorizes that while the Khmer's success can be attributed to the harnessing of water, it could also have led to their undoing. Such was the fine balance of nature that if irrigation and the storage of water were not kept up, they could easily fall into disrepair.
The water system was very fragile because it was so sophisticated. And the problem is, if it's not well maintained, it could easily become blocked by sediment.
The kings who came after Jayavarman VII were less interested in grand building plans. It's also possible they stopped maintaining the intricate water system. Deforestation was also a likely contributor. So much jungle had been cut back for rice growing that undoubtedly the rivers and canals would have silted up, which in turn would have led to an ecological disaster for the Khmer. Christophe Potier believes the clues are obvious.
The pond is very clear there with the water. At the end of Angkor, it's pieces of the forest should have been very, very rare. Very. So deforestation is not a new problem. It's an old one.
It is most likely that it was a combination of these factors that led the Khmer to abandon their once great city. What remained of the Khmer court re-established itself on the banks of the Mekong, near Cambodia's present-day capital of Phnom Penh.
We're not talking about the actual collapse and total demise of a civilization. What happened was that they moved sensibly to the east, down to the Mekong River, and away from the Thais.
Now completely Buddhist, renouncing material wealth, the Khmer would never again embrace the lofty heights they had in Angkor. For 400 years, Angkor lay derelict and forgotten, until its rediscovery by Henri Mouot in 1860. Today, Angkor is recognized as a wonder of the world. In Cambodia's new era of stability, archaeologists from around the world continue to make fresh discoveries. At last, a world lost to the jungle is re-emerging. A major metropolis that for over half a millennium dominated a thriving empire. One of the greatest cities the world has ever known.